Let's talk about depth of field. Something that's very confusing, very hard to see, but it's a critical part of how we communicate. The visual focus between what we see, what we capture, and what we want to communicate is essential for a successful photograph. So let's look at a couple images just to talk about the classic thought and feel of depth of field. Now that's a classic look at depth of field, but let's put it into practical terms. Here we are in this beautiful canyon. We've got snow, we've got grasses, pine tree, water, lots of information. How do we segment that information out? Saying this is important, this is not as important. Look here, kind of look here, but don't dawdle, come back to here. Depth of field. First thing, the depth of preview button on the camera, as far as I'm concerned, is useless. When it closes down the aperture so you can see depth of field, it's so dark, such a small field, I highly recommend just learning depth of field much as we learned our multiplication tables as kids. Had to learn it 3 times 3 equals 9. Had to just memorize it. No way around it. Depth of field is kind of the same way. So, looking at the scene behind me, first thing you can notice is that I have a 24 to 70 millimeter lens on the camera. I have somewhat a wide angle to a somewhat telephoto of a zoom. That means that I'm going to somewhat compress the scene, yet I'm going to have focal points where I want your eye to look, and then come back to that point. So if we look at this scene, look off in the distance, perhaps the trees out there, about 400 yards out, as far as the lens is concerned, that's infinity. It's the points in front of that we have to decide how much is going to be in focus and not in focus. So my subject is that log with a slight bit of snow outline on it. That leads the eye through the scene. I'm going to focus on that point. Now how much is going to be in focus in front and behind is determined by depth of field. Now depth of field by itself is not just a selection of aperture, not by any means. First thing we need to consider is the fact that we have a 24 to 70 millimeter zoom. So this scene I'm going to shoot at 24 millimeter. I'm actually going to try to narrow down my depth of field. I do not want everything in focus. Now you might say, well, just close to 2.8 and away you go. But what if I want more in the foreground and less in the background? I could change my focus point. Focus not perhaps on that log, but on the near shore of the creek here. Now what happens if I do that? Well, let's look at this for a second. The physical distance that I have to travel right now, that physical distance affects depth of field. How is that? Depth of field is a relationship between the physical distance from our subject to the camera, and then from that subject to the background. In other words, if that tree line was much closer to this log, 2.8 might not be enough to blur it out. I might not be able to blur it out in camera. Very important. Or conversely, if that background was really close and I wanted to bring it in focus, it'd be very easy to do. But since it's so far back there, and I'm using let's say maybe a 200 millimeter lens, pulling that depth of field is almost impossible. The physical distance is so great, we don't have that kind of latitude with our lenses. So depth of field is not just this point of focus in front of and behind the subject, like those examples we just saw happen to indicate. But more importantly, depth of field is a relationship, one you have to get a feel for. You have to understand, for your lens, your style of photography, the distance between the subject and the camera, the background and the subject, all those come into play when it comes to depth of field and using it to your benefit. So let's go and make a couple images and see how it plays out in this scenario right here.